How's it going, Elementalists? I'm back with another starter deck overview today, and today we're talking about Divebombers. Divebombers is a wind-fire tempo deck, and is probably the closest thing that Elementile has to an aggro deck. Generally in this game, just mindlessly trading your units for damage, trying to ignore all of your opponent's threats on the board and just go straight to face, isn't met with a lot of success, just due to the tug-of-war nature and having to get over to your opponent. Generally doesn't work out that well. But this deck basically sets up a position in its own second row. It'll fight for a position there so that it gets a setup that it can use to go for a win around turn 7. Basically rush all its units in and take its opponent out in one hit. So as usual, I have separated the deck out into ground stakes, fleet units, removal spells, and utility spells. So let's start taking a look at some of these categories. So first up, I want to talk about the fleet units. The fleet units are really the core of this deck, and the main reason why it only has to fight for a position on its second row before eventually trying to just blitz its opponent and take it out in one turn. A lot of these units fly and are highly maneuverable, and a lot of them even have 2 flying movement, making them the most mobile units in the game. This means that these units largely take fights on their terms and get the first hit in. As long as they're not totally on the back foot, they can choose when they want to go in and when they want to fight. And the unit I want to highlight out of this section is the Spirit. The Spirit has that 2 flying movement, making it among the most mobile units in the game, but only costs 2 elements at 1 light and 1 wind. And for this cost, the 3 front attack is incredibly powerful. Basically, just having this unit in your starting row will give your opponent pause playing anything that it's able to destroy. Even though units it destroys go back to your opponent's hand, most opponents don't want to lose that tempo, so it really does set them back. But they can't just sit there and play nothing, because if they do that, the Spirit can move forward, take 2 rows of space, and you can start reinforcing it at that position if you want, and just start kind of choking your opponent at that point. While this deck doesn't need to do that, it's totally content to just sit on the second row. If your opponent is not being proactive, you can in fact take that space and be threatening there as well, and just rush them down. So yeah, playing the Spirit buys you a lot of time or space depending on what your opponent is doing just by existing, and is a great turn 2 play in this deck. Next, I want to talk about the ground stakes. Now, ground stakes is kind of a funny name. It's not really a card game term, but hopefully you'll understand what I'm talking about once I'm done explaining this section. You'll notice that these are all fire units, and fire units have a lot of health for their cost. So not only are these guys early game bullies that can help secure you that space in the second row that you're looking for to occupy with your flying units so that you can then blitz your opponent, but these are also just units that have a lot of health, so that when your flying units go in to take space, you can summon a ground stake next to them to secure it. These guys are basically there to secure your space for the next turn, because essentially if you rush in with a bunch of flying units, they're pretty frail generally and can be taken out by your opponent, and then you lose all that space for your next turn. If you couple them with one of these guys, it's very unlikely that your opponent will be able to take out your fleet units and these guys with a bunch of health at once, so you'll probably have that space going into the next turn. And no unit is more symbolic of this than the Flame Brute. At 10 base health, he has the highest base health in the game, but unfortunately at -1 base armor, he has the lowest base armor. But if your opponent can't hit him with multiple attacks or some nasty on-hit effect or something like that, he can be very, very difficult to take out and can secure you that space for at least the following turn, if not longer. So when you do finally go in to rush your opponent down, if you aren't able to get the job done in one turn, you can always set up one of these guys if you have the elements, and hopefully you'll have space to summon units deep and finish the job on the next turn. Next up, I want to talk about the removal spells in the deck. Now, if you're playing fire, you're probably packing a few of these just because it's one of the things fire does best. And the one I want to highlight out of all of them is Fireball. For 1 fire element and 1 Triversity, a lot of times in this deck, you're actually going to get away playing this for just the 1 fire element, because this deck likes activating Triversity very early on. If you're playing cards like the Spirit on turn 2, and then getting into fire to play the Fireball, you'll have this on turn 3 and just play it for 1 fire element. And a lot of times dipping into light is not that big of a deal, because you're going to want to play things like Divine Gift or Spirit later on anyway. So this deck loves activating Triversity, which makes this card very cheap, and 5 damage for 1 fire element is incredibly efficient removal. This has range to take out things in the back without having to endanger your wind units going out there to do it themselves. And it's just very good at taking out unarmored units. Or even if they are armored or they have a little more health, it can soften up threats that your wind units might not be able to deal with in one hit so that they can effectively take them out when the time comes. And last but not least, I want to talk about the utility spells in the deck. Now, like most decks, these utility spells can do all manner of things, but there's a couple I want to highlight specifically, and the first one is Blowback. Now, you can always use Blowback for its typical use case in this deck. If you find yourself overwhelmed and you're not able to secure any space at all, you're on the back foot, you can always use this to push back 3 threats and just buy some time. But this is also a very important countermeasure to ranged units. Ranged units present a unique problem for this deck because if you're trying to set up on your second row, but your opponent has a bunch of ranged units on their starting row, you're just going to get blinked away at and killed, and a lot of your fleet units can't take very many range attacks before they die. So this is where Blowback comes in. If you set up units on your starting row and your opponent's setting up units on their starting row, ranged units on their starting row rather, you can use Blowback to push some of those units forward towards you and then move your units up to take them out safely. And this basically allows you to take out those units without having to sacrifice units getting up to them or put units in unsafe positions and basically trading them for these ranged units. So Blowback can be really good at answering that specific threat to this deck. And the other card I want to talk about is Divine Gift. This deck at its core is a combo deck. You're generally looking for specific pieces before turns 6 and 7 where you are trying to set up that one turn kill. And Divine Gift can help you find those combo pieces. You're generally not going to have the prowess cost of 3 light because 3 light is a huge investment for a primarily wind and fire deck, but just paying the 1 light cost is not that bad for getting the one piece you're missing so that you can actually end the game. And these 2 copies of Divine Gift kind of work as wild cards to make the deck more consistent and make sure you get the pieces you need. And that actually segues perfectly into the next section. So let's talk combos. The first one I want to go over is Phoenix with Combust. Now, Phoenix is one of the premier finishers in this deck, one of the units you want to set up on your second row to go for that turn 6-7 win. Phoenix will run into your opponent's back line and leave them between a rock and a hard place. They can't exactly kill this thing if you have other threats on the board because it'll make them all a lot stronger and more mobile on your following turn, so then they can just run in and finish the job. But they don't really want to leave this alone either because it has pretty threatening attacks itself and can start picking off units or just dealing direct damage to your opponent. So if their solution to get around this is, well, I'm just going to ignore it and I'm going to turtle up and hunker down and just protect my back line by populating it full of units, that is where Combust gets around that situation. Combust allows you to explode your Phoenix, not only giving all of your units the boost that the Phoenix gives when it dies, but also deals, if the Phoenix is at full health, 6 damage to everything around it, which could clear out all of those units that were preventing your guys from getting in. So now all of a sudden, they can't leave it either, because you might just explode it in a big fiery bomb and get the benefits of it dying anyway. These 2 cards are a pretty... Together, they really leave your opponent with not very many good options to deal with this thing, and which is why this is one of the marquee finishers in the deck. Next up, we have Jirak the Skirmish Commander with Spirit. Now, Jirak works with a lot of cards in this deck. It basically makes it so whenever your units move, they get strengthened for the turn. So when they're flying into attack, their attacks are just that much more lethal and that much more effective. Jirak is also one of the marquee finishers in this deck because just being on the board makes it so when you rush in all your units to take out your opponent, they're just that much more lethal and potent and make sure you can get the job done in one turn. Now, the reason he works really well with Spirit is because Spirit is a very mobile unit that's very cheap. You can have a lot of copies of this on the board, so that when Spirit comes down, or when Jirak comes down, you can move in all your Spirits, and now all of a sudden they're all hitting for 5 instead of 3, which is a huge upgrade. It almost doubles their attack if they move with their full 2 movement, and again, these are very cheap, so you can have a bunch with them. It's just the best way to illustrate the value that Jirak can give to all of these units, and one of the units that can capitalize the most on his boosts. And last but not least, we have the Wisp and Flame Brute. We already talked about Flame Brute. He's one of the premier ground stakes in the game. The reason he works so well with Wisp is because Wisp, again, has that 2 flying movement, so it can just fly in and you can place a Flame Brute down to scream for him. But also, Wisp can be used in the early game to fly into your opponent's back row and then activate its Blink ability, turning face down and basically non-existing. And the whole time the game goes on, your opponent basically has to keep someone on top of this guy unless they want him to perhaps turn into something very, very hardy like the Flame Brute. Because while the Wisp is face down, he basically doesn't exist, but if your opponent doesn't have a unit covering him up, at any point you can return him to your hand and summon something this huge in his previous space, and all of a sudden your opponent has something very deep that they have to deal with immediately, or there are just going to be a bunch of threats and reinforcement on your following turn, just very deep in their lines, and they're going to be in a world of hurt. And that's why these two work together incredibly well. When it comes to starting picks with this deck, it almost doesn't matter as much as other decks, just because it's very rare that this deck is going to leave you high and dry. Its curve is generally lower because it prefers playing multiple small units to one big play, and because of that, it's very unlikely that you're going to be left with nothing to do in the early turns. That being said, it is really important for this deck to have good momentum in the early game because it is trying to set up and fight for position on its second row from the word go. So let's get into some of these picks. As always, if you're going first, the safe picks are always going to be 1-drops. And we have 2 options in this deck. There's the Sprite. The Sprite is not really going to be directly combating very much at all. It's very frail. Its attack edges are pretty weak, but it does replace itself when it's summoned. It allows you to draw a card, and it does buy you some space. You can push this thing forward and start building on that second row very easily, and it doesn't have to engage if it doesn't want to because it does have that flying movement. Or you can go with the Powerful Pup if you want to just try and bully out the gate. Everything I said about this card in the Radiant pack still holds true here. It is a bully. It fights other 1-drops very, very well and can even go toe-to-toe with some 2-drops. So if you just want that good momentum in the early game but less mobility and it doesn't replace itself, you can opt for this pick instead. Now if you're going second and you're going to have 1 extra element, you can go for the Spirit. We've already talked about this card a lot. I think everybody at this point understands why it's powerful. You put this thing down, threatens a lot of space immediately. Great early game unit. It does leave you in light early on, which will, weaken your access to fire for a little bit. You'll have to be basically making up the difference for fire for the next couple turns, but I still think it is a strong play if you're going to have two elements on your first turn because you're going second. Or you can opt for the Feverish Imp. The Feverish Imp is in both of your colors, is pretty mobile, and it has good reach with its Final Sting ability. A lot of things probably don't want to push into this because it can trade up, especially armored units, because that Final Sting gives it extra attack power and armor piercing, so it can kind of trade up, so to speak. So this is very good against armored decks and leaves you in both of your colors, making it a pretty solid pick. Next up, you have Divine Gift. Divine Gift can be anything, so it's incredibly flexible, but paradoxically this can be a little bit risky because if you don't end up drawing any of these early plays, you really need to have something on the field early with this deck. You don't want to be on the back foot. You don't want to be leaving elements unspent if you can help it. So even though Divine Gift can be anything, which makes it seem like the safest option, if you end up bricking in your opening hand, which is admittedly rare, but if it does happen, you might have to turn around and spend this to get an early game play. One of these things you could have just picked up instead, and then all of a sudden, you have a light element, which is kind of outside of your colors, and you're an element down just to make up for what you would have gotten anyway. So it can be really useful because it can be used to get anything later down the line, which can be very helpful. At the same time, if you do happen to brick your opening hand, you do end up a little bit behind. So double-edged sword here, which is why I kind of count it as risky. And then last but not least, you can grab some of the heroes or marquee finishers in the deck. Talked about Phoenix, why it's so important. The downside to taking this is, again, you may not have early game plays, but that is less likely with this deck and it's low curve. So, and because of how important this card is to get set up on turn 5 on your second row to go for that next turn win, I can totally see starting with this card. Likewise, Jirak, just every card in the deck builds well with this. but it is kind of hard to play on turn 4 sometimes with the 4 specific element cost. But getting him out is just very powerful. It brings the best out of all your units, so I can see starting with this guy as well. And lastly is Sparky. Sparky is the other hero in this deck that we haven't talked about much. He's pretty cheap as far as heroes go, and again, this deck prefers a low curve and multiple units, which is what makes his Emboldened ability so powerful. Every time a unit of yours attacks, the next unit its attack is going to be stronger, and then the next unit that attacks, that attack is going to be stronger, and that pairs really well with Sparky's double strike ability or your Frenzied Salamander's double strike ability. They get double the value out of these attack boosts. So Sparky can be really useful if you're planning on swarming. And as a pretty cheap unit, it does cost a 2 fire, so you're going to be making up the wind later on, but it's really not that bad. I could totally see starting with Sparky. The only thing is he's more powerful the more units you have on the board. So playing him on turn 2, you're really not going to see the most of his potential until later down the line. Even though he only costs 2, he's more of a play that you would go for on turn 4 or 5 alongside 1 or 2 other units rather than playing him right on curve at turn 2. Which is why starting with him early might not be the best idea because you don't necessarily want to play him early. So I've talked a lot over the course of this video about fighting for position on your second row, and now we're going to start looking at some strong positions that enable you to win the game with this deck, basically what you're building towards. And if you're able to get a position like this by turn 5, honestly, good luck for your opponent. It would be very rare that they wouldn't be able to take out any of these threats that you've set up. Generally, when you're fighting for position on your second row, it is a fight. There will be some losses. But if these are your first 5 plays and you're able to put them in these positions, your next turn, you can just send in your Phoenix to basically anywhere. It could get any of these tiles. Basically, it's pretty tough to stop aside from just like a full wall, either here or here. So this thing can go wherever it wants. Once that happens, again, you're leaving your opponent in a very tricky position because this Feverish Imp can fill in here, and then they either kill this thing and all these things come in to basically take them out of the following turn. We can, get everything wherever we want, or they leave this and it just starts picking off units or doing a ton of damage to their face. So this position, once you get here, this is incredibly powerful. Really, really tough to deal with, and this is kind of what the deck is shooting for. The next position I want to discuss with this deck is a little less about building for that second row and a little more how to find a cheeky win in specific scenarios. It more represents like a win condition that you could be shooting for rather than like a core game plan, and that revolves around the combo we talked about earlier with the Wisp and the Flame Brute. Basically, having this position allows the Flame Brute with a bunch of health to screen for the Wisp, and just these 2 units alone can be difficult for your opponent to deal with. They basically need like some sort of AoE effect plus an extra unit to take out the Flame Brute, or they need units all around here to be able to get enough attacks off to kill the Flame Brute and then also kill the Wisp. Because basically, if they're attacking the Flame Brute and then they remove it, then they probably have used up these 2 attacks. It's hard for them to get anyone in here to deal with the Wisp now. So it just represents nearly a win condition on its own, and all you have to do to set this up is have a Flame Brute in your hand and have a Wisp survive anywhere on here. Because from this row, it can very, very easily just slip into a corner or slip into, just get past whoever, slip into one of these corners. You summon a Flame Brute to screen for him, and you have this very strong position all of a sudden. So this can happen on this side. It's just as effective. And the reason this represents a win condition is because if you ever have a unit survive in your opponent's starting row like this, let's say, they were able to take out the Flame Brute even, but they left the Wisp on the field, then any of these open tiles, including the one the Wisp is in, can just become gigantic threats that are going to deal big damage to face. So that's why this is so powerful, and again, not really a position, but a win condition you should be searching for when you play this deck. So I think that's going to do it for my overview of Divebombers. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. If you like mobile units, aggressive decks, and explosive combo finishes, please give this deck a try. I highly recommend it. I think you might really like it. And as always, I look forward to seeing you on the field of Elementile.